Hey everyone, Ben here from Stellar Work. In today's episode, we dive into a very interesting topic, where rumors around Elon Musk meet the fact of everyday work life. I'm talking with Peter Stevens about how Elon runs companies and all the good and bad that comes with it. We tried our best to extract some practical takeaways for you along the episode, so make sure to tune in. Hey Peter, good having you here.
Hey, Benjamin, nice to be here.
Awesome. So we just met in Munich on a course with Joe Justice, and we met quite some years ago when I wanted to be a certified Scrum Trainer with the Scrum Alliance. And then years have passed. I ditched the whole idea, and then we met in Munich, and we had this wonderful chat about how Elon Musk runs companies and how that differs from other companies and what other companies could learn from it. And I'm so glad that you agreed on recording this episode with me. So really glad having you here.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here. I think the Scrum community has always been about looking for better ways of running organizations and running projects. And, I really think the Musk companies are taking it to the next level. Even though most companies are not already at the current level, they're, kind of at the previous level. And so there's really exciting things going on. And I'm excited to be a part of that.
Absolutely. For everyone out there who don't know who you are and what you're doing, can you give us a brief introduction?
Sure. So my name is Peter B. Stevens. I'm best known for, good question. I'm best known as a Scrum trainer. That's been my day job for about 15 years. In recent years, I've been increasingly well known for my work on personal agility. So that is taking the ideas of Scrum and Agile, scaling it down to the level of the individual, which has allowed me to scale it back up as a self-organization, self-leadership framework, and even as a general leadership framework for companies of any size. And most recently, I've been getting interested and excited about agility for hardware. It started with extreme manufacturing, where I had the honor of teaching the first XM course in Europe, or co-teaching it with Joe Justice back in about 2013.
Wait a second. What is an XM course?
XM is extreme manufacturing. Okay, so think of, extreme programming was kind of the original agile development framework. Well, extreme manufacturing is taking the same notions of, let's take the stuff that works and turn the dials up to 11 so that it goes better. And the techniques were pioneered by Joe Justice on his Wikispeed project to create a 100 miles per gallon street legal car. They've been applied most successfully at places like Tesla and SpaceX. We see the same patterns over and over. And as I say, I was present at the birth. I actually documented the 10 principles, and I've kind of been on the fringes of that ever since. But this year, I realized that all of my customers all of my big customers are hardware customers, and they're facing exactly the same problems. Their time to market is way too long. It takes, multiple years, 4 or 5 years to get a product out on the market, maybe longer. And about halfway in, they realize they're building the wrong product, and they have to start over from scratch, which is expensive. And of course, in the hardware space, everything that we want to build is coupled to actual real costs, because we have to make factories and production lines. Almost every industry that I've been involved with has some very expensive step, which makes it difficult to change, and you need to amortize stuff over longer periods of time. But that
you're basically saying, so the idea behind what you're saying is that there are principles and practices out there that, let's say, an Elon Musk company such as SpaceX or Tesla is using, that other companies could adopt. So you could help them to become as fast or even faster.
Well, Tesla and SpaceX, they're defining competition as speed of innovation. So they're setting out to be the fastest. And, I think for most of us, even keeping up with them is going to be really hard, passing them. Wow. That's like saying, we're going to, get past, an Olympic sprinter. Could happen, but man, it's going to take a lot of training to get there.
So what do you think are the defining factors when it comes to speed in, let's say, an automotive company, just like Tesla or Volkswagen or BMW?
Okay. Well, there are a couple of things, at a very practical level. Okay. What do we optimize for? Okay. And most automobile companies these days are somewhat inspired by Toyota. They optimize, they improve their production. They want to reduce variability. They want to reduce the unit cost of production. To do that, they are willing to accept very long production runs. Okay, so if we look at the first car off the line and the one that comes off of the line 3 years later, it's within the limits of how the clients can order the car. Those cars are exactly the same, and that's what they strive for, because variance makes them expensive, especially in the maintenance. But the problem is when you have that attitude, you can't change the product, you can't innovate. And when your competition is striving to innovate faster, well, all of a sudden you need to be able to innovate faster too, and that's what's very difficult for modern companies. They respond very slowly. They change very slowly. The changes are very expensive, and so there's a real danger that companies are going to just run away from them. And no place do we see this more clearly than in the marketplace for electric cars, where the major manufacturers are only now. What is it? When did the Roadster come out? I think it was back in like 2005 or 2006.
I thought we're still waiting for the Roadster to really come out.
Well,
at least for the new model.
There was the original Roadster, and now they're trying to bring out a new, Ferrari killer Roadster. But that's that one we're still waiting for. But the original kind of proof of concept to prove that electric cars were real things, not a golf cart, I don't know. Don't quote me on figures, but my recollection is that's around 2005 or 2006. So we're like 15 years down the road, and only this year are the competitors really coming out with, electric cars in significant numbers. Porsche's had the Taycan on the market for about a year, maybe two at the most. Well, no, a little bit longer than that. It came out at the beginning of COVID, so about 4 years. So, it's taken the companies a long time to react. And that's the challenge that they have. The market changes and they can't react.
Wouldn't you agree that the pace of innovation at Tesla also got slowed down, because we've only seen 3, or if you include the Cybertruck, 4 different models? Like the Model 3 and the Model S didn't really change big time. Like from the looks, it looks pretty much the same. Model 3 got new headlights, but everything else.
If you look at, I actually researched this, and if you look at the cars, they got fairly major facelifts, every 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got a new product line every 3 year. I would consider that a pretty fast rate of innovation. When we look at, the major manufacturers, they give them their cars facelifts maybe every 7 or 8 years. And how often do they bring out a completely new product line? Okay, so there's, I think there are real challenges here to create something new. And I think Tesla is the first new automobile manufacturer, certainly the first new profitable automobile manufacturer in 100 years. So, what they're trying to do is extremely difficult. We always wish that the product were there faster. But the question is, what are we comparing it with?
So how would you go along if, let's say, Volkswagen would come up to you and ask, hey, Peter, so we want to be as fast as Tesla. We want to increase the pace of innovation. What should we do? Like, give us 10 steps. Okay. What should we do?
Okay. Well, I think the first question that they need to ask themselves is, how fast do we want to be?
And how much fast?
And how much
speed.
Rocket speed. Okay.
Everyone wants rocket speed fast, right? Nobody would.
Everyone says, I want it. And then they have to do it. And doing it implies change.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how much are they willing to change to get it?
Yep.
Okay. So, I was trying to come up with a good analogy for kind of how Tesla and SpaceX work. And I actually visited the SpaceX facility at Boca Chica last summer. And what struck me about it is, man, this place feels like a beehive, and there is an incredible amount of motion. And I've been to factories before, and I have never seen any place with anywhere near that much energy. And when you look at the way Tesla is organized, imagine, you've got the queen bee, who's kind of giving the direction and the vision and everything else, and everyone else is running around like mad. There's actually not much hierarchy between the queen bee and all the other bees, and all the other bees are kind of self-organizing themselves around the mission. In the case of Tesla, that mission is to catalyze a change to sustainable energy. Okay, so that's their, maybe 50-year vision of what they're trying to accomplish. That's what they started out with. And so, I think there are really two levels where Tesla and SpaceX are really very different than every other company, or almost every other company you've ever seen. The first of all is they start out with a compelling, 100 to 1,000-year vision of what they're trying to achieve. And then they say, okay, what is making it difficult to achieve that? Joe Justice calls this the limiting KPI. Okay, and they say, okay, we've got to optimize around that. Okay, so for Tesla, one of those things is the efficiency of their cars. So they're striving every day how to make it a bit lighter, how to make it a bit cheaper to manufacture, how to make it a bit more energy efficient, how to make the batteries a bit more capable. Okay, and they iterate on that really very continuously. And they've got KPIs around this that they can make visible more or less in real time. Okay, so we've got this long-term goal, and then we've got this very, very short-term intense focus on iteration or on improvement. And what you don't have is much management and hierarchy between these two things. So you start out with very simple directives. Anybody can talk to anybody in the company to serve the mission. Mm-hmm. And so we get this very strong team-focused organization where the people kind of based on knowing what the mission is and based on according to Joe at Tesla, this is now AI based. I've seen other companies do this based on just having product owners whose job it is to figure out what is the most valuable thing we could do this month, and then the teams organize around the mission literally every month. So there's this kind of fluidity in the organization and this clarity of purpose. Then within that context, everything else is mostly self-organized. And I think that's one of the big points of disbelief that, say, a VW or a Mercedes or any other classically managed company is going to have. How do you possibly get people to organize like this? And the difference is, the Musk companies all have a compelling vision. They've got this 1,000-year vision. And so how do you create this 1,000-year vision? I think that's going to be and get this level of organization. I think that's going to be the challenge.
And don't you think it's a big part of it is also having a lot of data and a lot of transparency, but because at some point you need to align all of those people to a certain goal and not like this 1,000-year vision, but like get EU regulations checked for the new vehicle. That consists of like 1 million to-dos, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have to visualize those to-dos. You need to have like checklists and very good, let's say, project management, facilitation, transparency skills behind it so that everybody could jump on the job and like self-organize around the work.
Well, I think, what you've described in the agile world is called product ownership, which is figuring out, what is the most valuable thing for us to work on now. And, obviously, if you're doing something complex like building a car, you ask yourselves the questions, okay, what is preventing us from selling this car? If we look at the original product backlog from Project Wikispeed, the challenge was to make a street legal car that gets 100 miles per gallon. Okay, that's what you needed to do. So win the X Prize. Here are the two challenges: make a street legal car, have it get 100 miles per gallon. Okay. Now, in terms of what you have to do to make it street legal, at least in the U.S., that's quite knowable. There's a list of you go to the appropriate authority and they will tell you exactly what tests have to pass in order to make that happen. That problem of getting the 100 mile per gallon car. Well, that's a much more difficult problem. In fact, we would say this is a complex problem because you've got lots of ideas on how to optimize the car, but you don't know until you've tried them whether they're actually going to work. And so, yeah, you do have to figure out what these things are. And this is where the concept of, well, how do we figure out what we need to do? And what is our top priority now? Yes, these are absolutely questions that still have to be answered. What I think is interesting about, say, Tesla is at the foundings of the modern version of Tesla, they actually started with a working car. That if someone had taken I think it was a Lotus Elise, and they put an electric motor and a battery in it, okay, and they already had something that worked, okay, and then they say, oh, well, let's make it something that we can sell, and prove that electric cars are something viable, for the real world. And I don't know, that took them about 5 years to make it happen because the distance from having a prototype which kind of goes around the track and actually being able to sell it was quite, and being able to manufacture it in, you know, well, by modern standards are very small volumes, but compared to a one-off that you've created in your garage are very high volumes. That was a long road, and all that had to happen. But I think what we underestimate is, a clear mission and a clear objective. Engineers are problem solvers, and so we hire engineers to solve problems. And we don't need to tell them what to do in words of one syllable. In fact, quite the opposite. When we have that problem solving too centralized, like in the days of Henry Ford, the people actually doing the work aren't allowed to think. And so anything that comes, any challenge that comes up, well, it has to go back to the central thinker, and that person becomes a bottleneck. And
I could also imagine that it's way in terms of building an efficient company, it's way easier if you start from scratch than if you have like this multiple thousand employees distributed all over the globe and all those processes in place and all the hierarchy in place and all the standards that you've set along those decades of business. I think it's quite hard to jump and use the principles that Elon Musk used to start a company and apply it to a legacy company, right?
So, in the software world, some companies have had success with that. Okay, here in Switzerland, they have the Lean Agile Scrum community of the Swiss. What do they call the Dachverband, the umbrella organization for pretty much everybody doing anything related to IT. And they have one company after another. Most of them are fairly substantial companies, brand names that you've heard of, talking about their agile transformations. Okay, and how they've worked and what's worked and what's challenging for it. Okay, this is I think relatively doable. Okay, and I think we've got a lot of patterns now that we kind of know how it works and we can make it happen. And you can apply those same patterns, something physical like building a car or building a rocket ship. What I think people haven't appreciated yet about Tesla and SpaceX is how they've really taken it to the next level. Now, if we're coming back to your example, what are we going to do with, the head of VW comes to us and says, hey, we want to accelerate our time to market. How do we do it? And there are really two approaches you can take. One of those approaches is kind of say, well, how do we transform the existing company? Or maybe how do we start with one product line and start doing that? The other might be, we've got this massive knot, about the Gordian knot that's so tangled up, how could we ever possibly untangle it? Maybe it's better not to try. Maybe it's better to start a new, an independent culture, isolated from the main culture, let them grow up using these principles. Okay?
Just like the Chinese companies are doing here in Europe, like let's say Geely, for example, who's buying older car brands and then reintroducing electric motors and batteries and all that EV technology into them, and then like building on top of that brand heritage.
Yeah, so you've got the brand, you've got the heritage, you've got the market space, you've got the dealer network. You build on the existing things, but what's happening underneath? It's kind of like when you renovate a building and the building is under historical preservation. So what you do is you leave the facade, you leave the wall, you tear down the building inside, and then you rebuild it from scratch. And that gives you a new building. That's actually kind of an interesting metaphor for the process of reinvigorating a brand or a company. And I could imagine doing something like that. That would be a viable way forward.
So what I've been doing is I've been always looking at the company from a holistic point of view. So it's not always just a development department or just IT or just software development or just hardware development or prototyping. It's like a chain of activities that needs to be done until you can like ship out a car to a customer. And that chain gets fed by other like value stream mapping, if you have heard of it. Basically, it gets information and lists and support from other facilities within the company. But you would go along this chain of value creation and see where you have like handovers, where you have priorities in danger, where you have teams not getting feedback from the customers or not getting feedbacks from their peers, and then just trying to fix that and see the overall duration that it takes from the idea to concept to delivery and try to shrink that down instead of saying, okay, let's be agile, let's do like 2-month sprints, and then just came up with some narrative of why we're doing it. Just look at what is going on right now, how long it takes right now, and if a car takes like 2 years, try to get lower, like 1.5 year or 1 year, and do this by focusing on the value chain creation and the different backlogs in between, the handovers, the different regulation parts. Try to parallelize as much as possible. That's what I've learned from Jeff Bezos, at least, by going through all his interviews that he's been giving. So that's
Jeff
like
Bezos
my approach that I've been following, and for me, it pretty much works very well.
Okay. Well, that's an incremental approach, and that's also very much aligned with, kind of lean thinking. Is to kind of, look at your process from start to finish, okay, and then look at where the bottlenecks are, and then try to optimize away the bottlenecks, okay. And that's, that is, when you're optimizing something that looks like a production line, that's a, very, very good way to do it, very well proven. But the problem is,
just to be clear with this is not working for any creative work. So if you have to come up with a design from scratch, this approach will not work out well. For that, you need to have a little bit of chaos for that.
Yeah, exactly. And what I'd like to do is maybe let's start with kind of what was your first step, which was to look at the value chain. Okay, and that's an excellent place to start, because the things that we're going to have to do from start to finish to get a car built, I don't think they're going to change very much. Okay, they still have to happen. How we do them and whatever. So one of the first questions to ask is what's the value chain? But the next question to ask is, who are the skills that are needed to get from the start of the value chain to the end of the value chain? And that kind of suggests the skills that you need to have in your initial project team. Okay, these are the skills that we need to bring together. Now, at this point, we can start to think about, well, again, it depends, a bit on the problem. If you say we want to shorten the time to market, usually at this point here, we're fairly early in the process, and we're creating a new product. So, so the idea is to let's get these people. And, the next thing to do is to start iterating on the product as soon as possible. But notice, the product is, if you will, the machine that we're trying to build, but it's also the machine that builds the machine. And these two things grow together. And this, by the way, is the one thing which companies can't do right now, is they create a very inflexible machine that builds the machine, which means they can't change their product much further down the road. So what we're trying to do is get these people together and get more of we're going to iterate on both of these things. That is the production line that builds the car and the car itself. And these are things that we saw, both at Tesla and SpaceX. At Giga Berlin, the people who built the factory are the engineers who were later going to work in the factory. And they started out, the first thing they did is they put up tents, and then within the tents, they started building cars. And, we had the same thing at SpaceX. They went down to Boca Chica. The first thing that they did, they went down with their notebooks and their cell phones. And the first thing they did was they started ordering steel, and they started hiring steel workers, to figure out, they just changed the architecture from carbon fiber to stainless steel. So the first question is, how are we going to build with stainless steel? Well, we don't even have the know-how. So the next thing they did was bring in the know-how. And the nice thing about SpaceX is so much of what they did happened out in the open next to public lands. There are webcams monitoring the factory 24 hours a day, and you could really see what they were doing. And you could see how they iterated from their first water tank to the first water tank that would hold cryogenically cooled liquids, to the first water tank with a rocket engine on the bottom of it, to the first flying water tower, all the way up to the suborbital tests. And they were, basically putting together a new iteration of the product about once a month. And a couple of things went boom along the way. But, a year and a half later, they had a flying suborbital prototype, that they were, at least in theory, ready to put on the booster to see if it would actually fly.
This is so cool. It totally reminds me of Kelly Johnson and the P-38 shooting star from Lockheed. I don't know if you know the story, but what he did is he hired the best engineers and technicians that he could find in Lockheed. At that time, it was called Lockheed. Now it's called Lockheed Martin. And they would rent a circus tent put that on a parking lot, and then just figure out how to design and produce alongside, right, and parallelize the different streams.
Right.
And it's crazy to see, like, so many years in between. Now Tesla doing pretty much the same thing. Also setting up a tent, also trying to parallelize the creation of the facility, and also the design and everything that works around it when creating a new vehicle. That is really interesting to see, because I don't see any big success cases in, let's say, the agile community or agile bubble that start with, we need to figure out what type of framework we're using, right? None of these success stories starts with, oh, let's do Scrum, let's do whatever, let's do Safe, let's do Less, let's do Spotify model, let's be, I don't know who.
Well, the reason we have the Spotify model is because Spotify was so successful with it. So there was, and I thought what was kind of interesting about the Spotify model is, my understanding is Henry Knieberg started working with Spotify when they were about 6 people. And I actually believe a lot of the patterns that make for command and control management, they get established somewhere between 6 and at the latest 50 people. And the bottlenecks start to make themselves apparent at around 80. In fact, the talk at the Swiss ICT yesterday, or 2 days ago, was about a company that had developed a very successful product. Their sales expanded, the company expanded up until they were about 80 people. And since then, well, the company has doubled in size, but their sales have stagnated, okay? And that's the problem, that they're now trying to break out of. And part of it is you start to choke on the complexity. And, that 3 layers of management where every manager is potentially a gatekeeper with the official goal of the company, but also their personal agenda to get promoted and, make sure they're at the top after the next reorganization. They introduce a lot of friction into the organizations. Okay. And I think, if you're a startup, the time to start thinking about this is after you've gotten, no later than when you've gotten your first, maybe your seed capital, Series A at the latest. You got to think about, having a more dynamic network, because a traditional hierarchical command and control pyramid has got a lot of bottlenecks in it, and it's just going to slow you down.
But still, Spotify didn't start saying, okay, let's invent the Spotify model, let's use a Spotify model, or let's use a certain framework. And I see the same with the Musk companies. I see the same with other very successful companies, let's say the Pfizer Moderna corporation, with Project Warp Speed, with Lockheed Martin at the end of the Second World War. Let's say John Deere in the 2020, 2021. They don't really have like a framework that they follow. It's more like they focus on what they're doing and finding their own way while doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think the purpose of the frameworks is to try to make successful patterns teachable. And I think, one of the problems that the Agile movement has had is we've gotten a little bit too focused on, kind of following the framework, as opposed to, focused on what it is that we're trying to do. And, I think one of the patterns that's kind of come out of the extreme manufacturing community is build something. And that's something we also saw at SpaceX and Tesla. They had prototypes very early, and they built on them, and they improved on them continuously. The problem with most of our big corporations today is that they've got this kind of assembly line mentality for how they're going to build products. And so even though they could be more agile than they are, they take their agile framework and they continue to stay very, very much in their waterfall pipeline mentality. And so they get some incremental improvement, but they don't get these, with the exception of, the occasional success case here and there, collectively, they haven't made the quantum leaps, maybe they would have hoped for, maybe that their consultants sold to them. We do see, teachable processes, things that we can focus on. I bring people together, get them talking together, get them asking questions rather than arguing with each other. And, I've seen it on numerous occasions that they've cut their time to market by a factor of 2 or a factor of 4. Okay. It can be done, but you got to keep your eye on the ball. And it's really about ensuring a good communication. And, too many people say, we're going to do Scrum or we're going to do Safe. How do we do a PI planning? Okay. And they barely understand how to do a PI planning. And now they're trying to do it with, 90 people in the room. And on the one hand, it's what do they get? We celebrate that they get something done at all, but on the other hand, it's there's a lot of friction when you're trying to do things big, and of course, there's a lot of fear when you do things at a big scale, because if things go wrong, there are a lot of people who are unhappy about it.
And there's also like a big bunch of unsuccessful and dangerous best practices out there. For example, what I've seen Scrum trainers showing their course attendees is that in a sprint review, they should like interview the customer, have a meeting with the customer on site, ask questions, present, get feedback, try to improve, try to get an idea of the right prioritization within the product backlog. But what I don't see them do is get like usage data from your app, get the classic product management stuff done first. Like it took a client of mine who created a dating app, asked me, we want to do Scrum because the startup is now growing, we have more people, we need a little bit more structure, and we thought we do Scrum. And then they said their sprint review is not working. And what I didn't get is their sprint review consists of a peer group and the developers and the product owner. And they would ask the peer group certain questions, give them tablets and iPhones and Android phones, and try to see how they use the app. And on the other side of the building, there are product managers which have heat maps, click rates, churn rates, everything that they don't look at. And I think that pretty much sums up my critique with everyday Scrum, let's say it this way, but put it this way, is that there is just so much out there that they don't know, that if you build a true Scrum team, you have to really include the different roles. And that doesn't end at like a product owner level. There's just way more than just interviewing and stickies on the wall and asking questions of how could the product or the sprint have run better. There's like data behind it. There is like certain practices within the product manager community. There's like digital feedback. There's everything out there. Like you could hire agencies that collect data from, let's say, dealers, right? And that doesn't really get used. Basically, it's just like a video conference on a Miro board where they collect stickies. That's incredible to me.
Well, so I think one of the things we need to do here is kind of cut ourselves some slack, okay? Because product development is solving a complex problem, and the problem with a complex problem is first of all, if you ask a question, you're not sure if you've gotten the right answer, and even more importantly, you're not sure if you've asked the right question. Okay, and so there's a huge amount of learning that happens in the process. Maybe if there's a mistake, it's not enough focus on being open to new ideas and trying things out and a culture of experimentation. But I think what we need to do is kind of celebrate what we've learned, but we also need to make it easier to learn and try out new things. So, one company which I was fortunate to learn about, I was actually one of the founders of the Lean Agile Scrum Group at Swiss ICT, and I founded a monthly meetup, or we call it a meetup now. At the time, it was known as the Scrum Breakfast. It later got renamed to the Agile Breakfast. And there was a professor from IMD in Lausanne, one of the leading business schools in Europe, and he was kind of curious about the Scrum thing. He'd written a case study for some friends of his, which, as far as I know, he never published. And the case study was about a company called Guidewire, and he said, would you want to work here? And he talked about these really strange things that were happening at Guidewire. So they were organized in really small teams of 3 to 6 people, and as soon as the team got more than 6 people, they would split the team in two. And they had this activity called a Scrum Master, okay? And it was a rotating responsibility within the teams. And so they did these things called sprints, which lasted a month. And at the company, they had 5 long-term positions called product owners, and they would define the work for basically the whole development arm once a month. Okay, they would figure out what needed to be done. And so the idea was every month, they would do this thing at the beginning where they figure out what they're going to build this month. And the funny thing is, as soon as they asked the question, the organization completely reorganized. That is, their teams were extremely fluid. The team that was together this sprint might not be together for the next sprint. And then they produced some stuff. The product owners would come with a new list of requests. The company would reorganize. So the whole company would reorganize, every month. And he was like, "How can this possibly work?" And in fact, their big concern as they were approaching to go public is, well, if we reorganize every month, how could we possibly sell ourselves to Wall Street? And they hired a CEO from IBM who was so shocked by the culture that after 6 months he left, and the company says, "Well, I guess we need to stay true to our culture because we're never going to fit in the shoehorn that Wall Street is expecting of us."
So have they IPO'd?
As far as I know, I'd have to check to be sure, but they're a successful company. They're present in Europe. The last time I looked at them, they were 700 people. I'm sure they're bigger than that now. I do know they still exist. They were born. They're a little bit older than Spotify, if I recall correctly. They started right at the crash of after the .com boom. Which was not an obvious time to start. So and I thought this huge fluidity in the company. It reminds me a lot of what Joe DX is talking about, the way they do things at SpaceX, where according to Joe DX, you've got actually AIs optimizing around these key KPIs, these limiting KPIs, and that's how people figure out, if you're looking for work, you look at the board, you see what's high value and decide what you want to contribute on, and you go off and do that. And so people self-organize around the mission.
So the AI would distribute the work.
It sounds the AI would prioritize the work, and the people would figure out what they want to work on. Okay.
And is that already like in practice in a Musk company like that?
I can't answer that question definitively. According to Joe, the answer is yes, but I can only quote the source, and I don't have, when I look at Joe DX, that's one of the few things that I don't have an original source on. On the other hand, we do know that there's this thing, I think it's called Tesla One, which is their kind of AI app, and they're positioning themselves as an AI company. So I don't have proof of it, but I don't have confirmation of that aspect of what's happening with Joe DX, but it does seem consistent with what they're trying to do.
One thing that really puzzles me with Tesla is that they position themselves as an AI company, but when you look at the amount of H100 chips from NVIDIA, like which company buys which amount of H100s, they're pretty far behind, right? There's like some people or magazines are not even mentioning Tesla as one of the major buyers of the H100. And at least Mark Zuckerberg or at Microsoft, they think AI is just a game of buying those H100s. Okay. Well,
that's a measure. Okay. And we can look at the measure, and the measure might be indicative of what's really happening, and it might not. I do know that Tesla makes their own chips, and that they're now kind of, representing, the value of their own chips and compared to the NVIDIA chips.
And same is true for Apple as well. Yeah. They also are very low on the on buying H100s, and they're also claiming they're designing their own chips. And the stock crashed is too harsh, but went down a little.
Whose stock are you referring to? Tesla or Apple?
Apple.
Apple.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the things, the stock market has got. Well, I think most people in the stock market have got no clue what's really happening. And business leaders also often have no clue because they try to manage everything through money and, kind of relatively simple things, which are easily understood. So for instance, we talk about Boeing with the challenges of the 737 MAX and also with Starliner and the helicopter. And I'm not sure what all their headaches are. But the guy who was CEO up until a few weeks ago, his background was in accounting. His only degree listed on the Boeing company, it's the CEO of a major worldwide corporation. His only educational credential is he has a bachelor's in accounting. Okay, how does that person know enough about airplanes to run an airplane company? Okay, and in fact, much of the fall of Boeing has been attributed to, the merger with McDonnell Douglas, and that's where the professional managers took over from the engineers. Boeing used to have a very strong engineering culture, much more than they do today. And as soon as the merger was completed, they moved the corporate headquarters out of Seattle. I think it's in St. Louis now. And that was kind of a sign of, the power has shifted, and 20 years later, 25 years later, we're seeing the fruits of this merger.
Do you think that it's basically the opposite of what Meta and Elon Musk is doing by basically eliminating the number of people not directly contributing to the product, to the vision, and having like these very low hierarchies within the company?
Well, I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. In fact, it's very interesting to compare. I did some modeling of this, and if we look at a typical, kind of hierarchical company, you would expect a ratio of, I'm going to call them support or management, or that is, you've got front, operational people and everyone else, and you'd expect a ratio of about 1 to 5. Okay, so for every 5 operational people, you'd have someone somewhere in the hierarchy of management. Okay, and you can actually predict fairly well how many layers of management the company's going to have. It's proportional, or at least in cases where I've been able to get data about both the size of the company and the height of the company. It looks like for every tripling of the company in size, you get another level of management. Okay, so we got all these managers, with strategies and goals and whatever, and mostly holding meetings with each other. And down there at the bottom are, some people actually trying to do work. Now, if you look at SAFe doesn't really change very much in terms of the structure. You still have, roughly 20% of the people in a SAFe release train are, some kind of supporting and coaching role. Out of 150 people, you'd have about 30 in a, release train engineer, product owner, business owner, something like that. If you look at Scrum and large-scale Scrum, and I'm pretty sure the proportions hold with Scrum at scale as well, you get about 10%. Okay, so rather than having 20% of your staff be in kind of a coaching or leadership formal, authority position, you got about 10%. Okay, and I think this, by the way, explains why SAFe is so popular in large organizations, because it doesn't really change very much organizationally. No one loses their job or sees their job called into question because you're doing SAFe, because it might not be a formal management role that it was before, but there's product owner, business owner. There are things for you to do. Scrum, on the other hand, is a bit scary, because all of a sudden, half of those supporting roles, they go away. You have to be someone operational. And, if we look at where Musk is trying to go with Tesla and SpaceX, I think they're trying to cut that down by get that down to 2 or 3%.
I think
and maybe
we saw his style
0%.
at Twitter,
Yeah.
or now X, like his style of reducing workforce and where he sees priorities. And then I thought, like, oh, this might be a good thing, actually, to really focus more on the engineering and the value creation part. And then he took over Twitter, done all of that. Then I've seen the same or quite similar pattern at Meta, when Mark Zuckerberg beginning of last year announced like the year of efficiency. And then they also had their layoffs. And they also have their restructuring of their strategy, like shifting away from the metaverse. And then at Salesforce, you see the same, like the activist investor coming in and then restructuring the company, doing all those layoffs, but focusing on the value creation and the engineering part, engineering and product management part, and reducing the number of hierarchy layers between them, because those are very expensive and are not adding the adequate value that they wanted to see. And then when you look at Tesla, what I was really surprised seeing is that Elon Musk laid off like a big part of the supercharger network team, which I, as a Tesla driver, like I've had a Model S, which is a great car, and then I bought a Model Y, which is also a great car, and always loved the supercharging network, and I was devastated to hear that he slashes those teams, and very frustrating to see. And I was wondering, like, what do you think was the reasoning behind it? Have you any idea of, because they're actually contributing value, don't they?
I must admit, I was puzzled by that one as well. I mean, I thought in the last year and a half or so, all of the major automobile manufacturers, with maybe one or two exceptions, have committed to, kind of the Tesla standard as the North American charging standard. Okay, and they really have the only charging network that works reliably. And they have the largest charging. I mean, they got a lot of advantages there. And I am kind of I'm puzzled as well. What we saw at Twitter is that Elon Musk has got no fear of breaking things, and I think certainly what happened at Twitter is he looked at where, who's producing value and who's not producing value, and he tried to get rid of everyone who's not producing value. Now, he probably gave us a good lesson in how not to do a corporate transformation, because obviously, he left people who he shouldn't have, and he fired people who he shouldn't have, and he got everybody at Twitter all upset and created a lot of challenges. I don't have many direct contacts into Twitter. The few that I do have actually been saying nice things about it. And my own experience as a Twitter user has gotten much better. I feel like I'm subjected to much less. Particularly radical right, just blah, the incitement to violence that was very common in Twitter, say during the elections in 2016 or 2020. So I'm let's put it this way. For me, the jury is still out on Twitter, but I think there is actual improvement going on. Now, I can't speak to what's happening with the supercharger group. I mean, the press has picked up, one or two things. Tesla doesn't really explain what they're doing, so it's kind of hard to know what's really going on. Maybe one thing which Joe talked about is Tesla's idea is they're not actually trying to turn a profit. I mean, they want to stay profitable, but they're not in it for the money. They're in it for their 50-year vision and 1,000-year vision of catalyzing that change. And one of the consequences of that is they reinvest their profit in growth. Okay, so what this means, though, is they don't have a lot of margin. And if they're going through a setback in the market, I can see someone like Musk saying, we have to cut costs dramatically to stay in sync with our market size, because we don't have a lot of air between how we're spending money versus how we're earning money. And so when the company is growing, then they can hire more. When the company is not growing, they hire less. And the other thing is we might actually be crossing the chasm now. I'm kind of wondering if Tesla has gotten the early adopters, and now they're trying to get to the early majority. And maybe we haven't actually gotten you there yet. And that's what this dip is, or part of this dip in the marketplace is we're saying, okay, the guys who are really impressed by the super cool high tech, they're on board. The people, like a colleague of mine is a salesman who makes customer visits all day, and she was saying, these charge times are going to kill me. They're much better than they were, but I don't have the range that I need, and I don't have the charge times that I need in order to be able to do my job. So I'm still waiting. Okay, and I'm kind of wondering if that's kind of one of the deeper crises that Tesla's facing right now, is they've gotten the easy people, and now they have to make products for a tougher market.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see. I'd like to circle back to what you're going to set up here in Europe, because we talked about you bringing the knowledge of Joe Justice and all the good practices and principles at the Musk company over to Europe. And I don't want to do an awful long commercial break at this point, but I'm really curious of what your approach is and how you're going to do it. Okay,
so maybe what I'd like to do is roll back the clock to when I first started thinking I want to do Scrum. Okay, and I went to Google. I limited my search to Switzerland, and I searched for Scrum. And in the top 10 hits, 7 or 8 of them were either about me, by me, or for me. And I thought, wow, I've got the market. And then I thought, my God, there is no market. Okay, and I think that's kind of where we are with agility for hardware. There are a small number of people who have been doing it, but not many, and they haven't been getting a lot of attention. Okay, and so I think we're kind of at that. It's blue ocean. Okay, the good news is it's blue ocean. The bad news is we're not sure if there's any food in the water or not. What I'm actually doing is there are two things. First of all, I think the place to start is community. Okay? And with a colleague of mine here in Germany, Markus Schmoltz, he's been building production lines and working with hardware and applying agile techniques to it for 15 years. So the first thing we did is we started a meetup group called Reinventing Manufacturing. And right now we're primarily physical. We're based or face to face. We're based in Zurich, and you'll notice we haven't chosen anyone's brand name here. We said this is about looking for better ways of building physical things. Okay, and we've had our second meetup, and we've now decided this is going to be a monthly thing. We hold it every 4 weeks in Zurich. And we're also looking to add a virtual component to it. I've got an invitation to Frankfurt, to participate in a meetup there. We have a guy coming in from Lyon in France who's is still the record holder for longest distance travel to come to our meetup. So that we've got kind of high energy and good enthusiasm, and that kind of reminds me of the early days of the agile movement. Okay, so that's kind of, if you will, creating an environment of people to discover it. Okay? And my assumption is that as people start to realize that other people are doing it and realize that it's possible to do it and have conversations with each other about effective ways to do it, that the attention is going to grow.
That sounds really awesome. Like, can you? I'm really wanting to join that group. So if you're doing it virtually, I'd be more than happy if I can get an invitation from you.
Okay, yeah, we'll be happy to. Well, you can join the meetup group virtually anyway, and the more people we have from outside of Switzerland, the more incentive we have to do it. And as I say, I think it's going to be. So maybe this talks about where I am professionally, and one of the things I've realized is that this is a bigger problem and requires more skills. And so what I'm doing, we have our working title Team XM. And what I'm trying to do is put together a team with of people who are experienced both with hardware and both with agility, so that we could actually go to a company and say, hey, we have the expertise and the know-how. And so I'm really excited that Marcos is on board with this idea. There's also Nancy. I'm always challenged by her last name, van Schunderveld. She's just Nancy van Schoo. But she wrote the book on agile development of safety critical hardware. Medical devices. So, between the three of us, we probably have, I would say, 30 to 40 years of agile experience, and 2/3 of that really focused on hardware. My own experience is a bit more broader than hardware. It's kind of everything else but software. I mean, I've done the software part too, but with the personal agility, that gives me more of an organizational focus and less of a hardware focus. Between the three of us, I think we've got all the bases covered. So we're looking at, we're at the awareness and interest phase, but we're also at the phase where, our potential clients are feeling the pain. The real thing that we're going to help them do is accelerate their time to market. Imagine if you could cut your time to market by a factor of 2. What would you be willing to do for that? There's some significant effort involved, but there's also some real benefits to the to the people who go that route. And so, what we're trying to do is build excitement around that idea, and hopefully a couple of them will ask for our help.
Awesome. That sounds really great. Like if me or anyone else listening here is curious about what you're doing, where can people find you?
So my homepage is sat-network.ch. You could also find me on LinkedIn. Look for Peter Stevens in Scrum, and that's probably the easiest way to find me.
Awesome.
We don't have there is the meetup group, which is just meetup.com/reinventing-manufacturing, which would help us find the meetup group. We're still very early on here, so we don't really have a formal web page, as a group. But I do have the XM program on my web page, so you'd find it if you went to my web page.
Awesome. That sounds great. So I'm going to sign up right after our recording, and I encourage everyone, coming to this far into the podcast to also sign up, and let's meet over there.
Sounds awesome.
Thank you so much for being here, Peter. It was great talking to you, and I hope we can do a second session and dig deeper into the AI stuff.
Okay, thank you, Benjamin. The pleasure has been mine. That AI stuff is really cool because you can really accelerate your own work, and you can improve the quality of your work by leveraging AIs, even with the standard tools that are out there. So we're going to have fun with that talk.
What a cliffhanger. All right. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Peter Stevens for joining us to discuss the innovative management style of Elon Musk and how it drives the success of his companies. Peter, your analysis was not only intriguing but also incredibly informative. To our listeners, if you're fascinated by leadership and innovation, keep an eye on Peter's work. Make sure you're subscribed to the Stellar Work podcast to catch all our upcoming episodes. We love hearing from you, so don't hesitate to reach out with your feedback. Until next time, keep innovating and pushing boundaries. Goodbye for now.
Hey Peter, glad you're here on the Stellar Work podcast. It's crystal clear. We met in Munich, learned a lot with Joe. Now it's time to share what we know. Peter Stevens in the spotlight, teaching us how to get things right, from Scrum to agility, hardware to on Stellar Work. He's guiding you. Elon Musk, SpaceX, and Tesla's way. Innovation speed, they don't delay. Peter tells us what we need to learn, how other companies can take their turn. Peter Stevens in the spotlight, teaching us how to get things right, from Scrum to agility, hardware to on Stellar Work. He's guiding you. Personal agility, scaling it up from the individual to the corporate hub. With the tree manufacturing in the mix, Peter's got the tools and tricks. From agile for hardware to the leanest lines, shortening time to market, making things fine. 1,000-year vision, a clear long goal. Peter shows us how to take control. Peter Stevens in the spotlight, teaching us how to get things right, from Scrum to agility, hardware to on Stellar Work. He's guiding you. Join us on this journey, learn and grow with Peter Stevens, the Agile Flow. Stellar Work brings you the best. Tune in now, let's ace the test. Peter Stevens in the spotlight, teaching us how to get things right, from Scrum to agility, hardware to on Stellar Work. He's guiding you. Join us on this journey, learn and grow with Peter Stevens, the Agile Flow. Stellar Work brings you the best. Tune in now, let's ace the test.